Hello and welcome to ProutCast. We had the immense pleasure of being joined by James Quilligan, an economist, systems thinker, and one of the most seasoned voices in global development and commons governance. Over the past 4 decades, James has advised organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, and HM Treasury, and worked with international commissions from the Brandt Commission to the Earth Charter. He's currently a senior research fellow at Aarhus University's Center for New Critical Politics and Governance, where he also helps produce the Planetary Choices podcast series. James has directed the Global Commons Trust, led the Brandt 21 Forum, and served with groups such as Economic Democracy Advocates and Cosmos Journal, all focused on reimagining economics through the lens of ecology, equity, and shared value. Drawing from biology, thermodynamics, and the study of complex systems, Quilligan shows how human economies are bound by the same physical and energetic principles that govern all life. He argues that only by recognizing these limits and managing our shared commons accordingly can we create a just and regenerative civilization. We hope you enjoy this conversation as much as we did.
Hi, James. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us on ProutCast today. So across the world, we're witnessing what some might call a polycrisis, like multiple kinds of crises at the same time, like widening inequality, ecological collapse, breakdown of the system that once held our societies together. And many of these problems that we're encountering, they stem not only from, or seem to stem not only from bad policies, but from how our economies themselves are structured. So who owns the resources, who benefits from economic growth, and who gets a voice in decision making. And with that in mind, I'd like to explore some ideas that could help us rethink the economy in this time of breakdown and transformation. So, to begin with, could you please explain what economic democracy means in everyday terms and why it's so relevant right now in a time when ecological systems are under strain and people feel increasingly excluded from decisions that are directly affecting their lives?
Well, thank you. It's very nice to be here. It's good to see you again. That's a profound question now. Economic democracy used to mean something different than it means now. It used to have a political dimension to it. It still does, but it's more complicated. And the political dimension is essentially that economic democracy means that people need to be participants in the decisions that affect their resources at local and regional levels so that there can be more equity in the process of producing and distributing resources and achieving more equitable purchasing capacity and having people take part in those decisions. Now, it also includes the extra dimension that you mentioned about the ecological crisis. And so it has become a more broad, conceptualized phenomenon that is necessary to rejuvenate economic democracy and bring it into the new era that we're in right now. In other words, what I would say is that the old version of economic democracy was defined more or less under liberal terms over the last, let's say, several hundred years, as the economy was going upward and we were within the carrying capacity of the limits of the planet. And now that it's beginning to go downwards, economic democracy has another meaning, which is that it's one thing to look at economic democracy on the upward curve, but it's another meaning as we move into an era of post-growth. It's all the more imperative that we factor the planetary boundaries into the meaning of economic democracy. So as we move ahead in the discussion, perhaps we'll get into that.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. That was a great answer. And what you're saying, obviously, I feel like an initial critique of that can be found in Marx when he talks about gaining ownership of the means of production. But as you're saying, this was from a different era historically, so that even he couldn't probably even imagine the kind of state of ecological breakdown that we're experiencing nowadays. Of course, that's a really important factor in the equation when we're talking about economic democracy today, is to include not only the economic factors, but also looking at resources and just looking at the natural world and how this is managed and who owns what and how what is being used or destroyed or exploited. So leading on from that first question, I have a case, kind of like a case study for you. So if you had the chance to guide one medium-sized country for a few years, let's say it could be the United States of America, or it could be Germany or any other country, what three structural changes would you make to move the economy towards fairness, ecological balance, and the common good? And here I'm thinking, for example, about reforms in ownership, taxations, or government based on the commons.
Well, that's an excellent question, but I would say that that's a question for economies that are going on the upward ascent, where we're not facing all the environmental pressures that we're facing now. And so what I would say is that I would take it a little more broadly. I think that we're not talking about individual countries right now. We're talking about all countries that are facing the same kinds of problems. And therefore, the solutions have to be negotiated at an international level. So before I could, run a country and then make the decisions for that country, I would like to expand the vision of this, the context of this a little bit, to say that in this world where the multilateral West, and now that excludes the United States because the United States isn't a longer multilateral power, along with the multipolar BRICS, which would just be the global East and the global South together. Neither of them have ideas that seem to me to be sustainable for economic governance and political governance in the future. And so what I'm suggesting here is that in order to figure out what's necessary at the international level, I think we have to take a more kind of planetary perspective. Planetary, by that word, I mean that we have to involve the biological aspect of biophysical economics in the geopolitical realm. And so that has not taken place yet. So if I was leading a country right now, I'd want to consult with all the other heads of state that and to come together to make a more universal declaration of the steps that we need to do to move forward. So now I'm getting back into what I would do as a ruler of my country, with the expectation that we have an agreement that all the other rulers do somewhat similar things in their own nations. And part of the problem with this is the institution of national sovereignty that we have right now. And so sovereign states was a pretty good idea with the theory, the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, I think. It's outmoded, and it doesn't account for international accountability. It just says, leave my state alone, I'll leave your state alone. I won't tamper in your state if you don't tamper in my state. And that's the social contract that we've made with our citizens. So for the first thing I would say is to my people, I've run for office on the basis of these facts, that if we divide up the world if we divide up the way the world works, we can see these dimensions. We live in a commons, and overlapping that commons, we've created a public sector, and we've also created a private sector. So the private, the public, and the commons are all factored into the ingredients that we need to govern our nation, just as I'm in contact with all these other nations to come to those same conclusions, that we have to see the planet on that basis. If we don't do that, then we're going to have conflicts between the private and public and commons in every nation, as well as between nations. And we're done doing that. We've had a lot of background in trying to figure out this combination of mixtures of how to create governance economically and politically. Now, because of the environmental dimension, we have to really all be on the same page. So what I would say to the people in my country, we're going to get it straight in terms of how to separate and give equal value to those three dimensions that I mentioned: the private sector, the public sector, and the common sector, so that they can work in union with each other, not only within our nation, but more broadly in the world. And what that would mean essentially is that international, or let's say planetary aspect of this covers what I would call public goods. The local and regional aspects of our nation and all the nations in the world have to do with the commons. And the old sector of the nation state and the corporations, which the nation state has been colluding with more recently, operates under the guise of the private sector. You can no longer say that the nation state, as we've evolved it right now, is in the public sector, because it's creating more favor for the corporations than it is for the citizens. So, therefore, there's a new social contract that needs to be created to guarantee citizens that they have the rights to govern their own resources at the local and local and regional levels through the process of subsidiarity. I'm promising my people that the state will devolve power to the citizens in our country and other countries in the world. At the same time, we want to move more power up to the international or planetary institutions to give them the ability to manage the planetary boundaries. And people maybe scoff at that, but after Johan Rockström has identified these boundaries that we've already breached, the idea of global public goods, or planetary public goods, let's say, is more important than ever. And as I earlier said, I don't think that we can go ahead with the idea of economic democracy unless we address the planetary dimension. So, in essence, I've just summarized this. There's three dimensions: the planetary, the dimension of the state and corporation, and then the local and regional, let's say, bioregions or commons that exist across the world. Those are very important factors. And, so what you have is the public sector at the planetary level, the private sector at the sort of the what we have now as sovereign states and corporations, and then the commons, which is the local and regional levels across the world. So to my people, I would guarantee that we would make reforms, not only politically to make that work, but also economically, so that there's this interdependent situation where all those three levels work together.
Okay, thank you for another great answer. And just to clarify for the listeners, so we were talking about BRICS. BRICS is basically this international group of 10 countries, including Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, I think the United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia, maybe another state I can't remember off the top of my head. But so it's a economic and political alliance of these states, which are mainly from the global south, and so like South America, Middle East, Asia, etc., Southeast Asia. And so I think just some brief comments on what you were saying, then we can move on to the next question. I think attempts have been made, like if we look at the Millennium Development Goals and certain agreements about how we should manage CO2 emissions, etc. The problem is that, as you're saying, because of this Westphalian kind of mindset of like every country fends for themselves. Most countries don't seem to follow these with a lot of not very rigorously. They seem to be more preoccupied with the growth, with the incessant growth of their own economies, etc. So that's one issue. And I mean, like a planetary government seems like a bit of a sci-fi utopian idea. In sci-fi, usually it's a reaction to an alien invasion, but in our time, as you've been saying, it's not that aliens are invading, but it's because there's this ecological catastrophe, this total catastrophe looming. You know, I remember while I was studying my undergrad degree in Dublin, once Noam Chomsky came and gave a speech, and he said, you know, in the next 50 years, the whole planet, the ecological system is going to collapse. And that really stuck with me. He was telling us as the young people, you know, we need to do something now. It's already too late, basically, or it's going to be too late soon if we don't react now. So I think that's a very interesting point to make, to like really shift the focus on we need to find a solution together rather than keep working with this kind of old Westphalian mindset that's like from the First World War or predating even that period. And yeah, so to moving on from this point you were making, also kind of building on that point you were making about the separation of the private, the public, and the commons, how do you think we should decide, or can we decide, whether an industry as a whole works best as a public service, cooperative, or private business model, especially in an age where the planetary limits and community resilience we're talking about matter, or should matter as much as profit or efficiency?
Right. I would also add to that technology and its influence. You know, some people are talking about the network state at this point, but I'll address that about how. So, my country, how would I like to see it working? As I said before, if states evolve more power to the local levels, the regional levels, I believe that would give a major boost to economic democracy. And one of the areas that it would really help, I think, is to devolve a lot of the corporate power down to small businesses. It would also enable cooperatives to emerge. And this is one of the points that Prout makes, an important vision of the world. I don't think Prout, when it was formed or written by P.R. Sarkar, had a complete grasp of the planetary and how it would evolve. But it definitely had a vision of how to adjust governance on the way down that curve that leads to a post-growth kind of era. And so let's get back into that. So why is it a post-growth era? It's because the resources that are available on the planet are becoming less available because of more population and more demand on those resources. The political powers haven't figured out how to manage this well in the past, and they're going to have a catastrophe on their hands because they're going to have to figure out new forms of governance for that in the future. And as a result of all that, I think that we are going to have to make major adjustments, as I said, in terms of the sovereignty of nations, because you can look at the whole history of colonialism and the whole history of the rise of the corporations as a function of the growing economy. And now on its way down, we have to get realistic about how to make the interdependence work at all these different levels. As I said, the local and regional, the level of states and corporations, and then the planetary level, which has to be addressed. And, you know, not only because we want to be able to distribute public goods as a result of our understanding of the biosphere, but also because of the planetary boundaries, which are making resources not only less available to people, but also the degradation of the planetary boundaries means that we've got to address the entropy that's being created in the world through our industrial practices, which leads me back to what you said about how industry can be transformed. So all of the things that we were talking about in terms of, small businesses on a local level, cooperatives on a local level will help to reduce the entropy that's being created by our industrial processes. And I think that technology can also contribute to reducing the entropy. And by that, I mean the degradation of resources, which is leading to greater disorder in the world. So it's not just political disorder and economic disorder. It's actually the physics of the planet and the biogeochemical nature of the planet is being degraded as a result of the industrial revolution and especially the pumping of oil and then it's not only the extraction of the oil, but it's also the heating and the combustion of the oil, which goes into the atmosphere. And the heat from that creates the disorder in the chemistry and the biology of the atmosphere. So given all that, I do think that the premises of Prout are adequate, but I think they need to be seen in a broader context, which is the planetary context in which there has to be three dimensions, or let's say three levels of governance, which is the planetary and the states. The states aren't going to go away, but as I say, the states will have to upgrade or turn much of their power upwards to empower the planetary institutions to make those decisions about the planetary boundaries. The states have to also devolve power to the local and regional levels to take more ownership of the resources at the local levels. Otherwise, if we go on the same way we have in the past of strong sovereign states who are really breaching the social contract with people, and corporations who are breaching the social contract with people because all they're concerned about is people not as citizens but as customers, then we're in for big trouble. And that's why a universal understanding of this has to evolve in order that all nations begin to get on the same page, which they've never been able to do through the United Nations. So I'm looking at a kind of really scaled up planetary United Nations, which actually delivers on the vision of all of these things I've been talking about.
Yeah, and as I was commenting before, like it might seem utopian, but it kind of is the only way forward when we look at the threat kind of ecological breakdown and collapse. And yeah, I really like the point you were making about the generation is not just it's not just of the social and economic systems, but also just of the geological and the biological. And how I like to think of it is actually the breakdown of the ecological system of our seas and our forests and the animals and the plants is our own breakdown, because in the end we end up eating the fish from the sea that might be full of microplastics, for example, because of the way that we are exploiting the oceans. So it all comes full circle. Anyways, to get into my next question, is it possible, do you think, to guarantee everyone's life essentials, which in Proud we also define this as food, shelter, healthcare, and education? And I would add to this also dignity, human dignity, while also setting fair limits on extreme wealth and resource use. And what might that balance look like in a sustainable economy?
Well, it's a key question, and it gets to the heart of the changes that need to be made. So let's take the framework of supply and demand that most people are aware of. I think, first of all, it has to change to a supply and need, because demand only recognizes how much money you have rather than what your physiological needs are. So if you happen to have enough money to pay for supplying your physiological or biological needs, then that's one thing. But the past metrics have been focused on supply and demand. Supply and demand actually is a very good, it's a good start, but it's been very misinterpreted and miscalculated. We need that kind of balance, but we need it in a different way. So we're talking about the supply of the energy sources and the energy resources of the planet that are available to meet the needs of not just the human population, but all the living creatures on the earth. That's what's critical. And so that really expands the meaning of supply and demand into a whole other kind of construct, which I think that we've intuited that in the past, but we really haven't fulfilled all of the requirements that it's going to take to understand that more clearly. In that regard, I would recommend looking at the works of Howard T. Odum and also Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who both looked at what I would call the supply side, but they would never have called it that. But what they were looking at is the amount of energy resources that are available on the planet and understanding the physics behind that as well as the biology. And then on the other side, the demand side, which I'm calling the needs side, I think that the Prout has the right understanding that the metric adjustments to the availability of resources on the planet have to be made in terms of the purchasing capacity that people have. So we think of purchasing capacity now in terms of the fiat currencies that we have now. So we measure it in terms of the fiat. This is where I've spent all of my career, 50 years, in looking at the way monetary value can be calculated in order to demonstrate the sustainable value of the earth. So my sense is that if we can get on the supply side, the carrying capacity of the planet correct, and on the demand side, the purchasing capacity of the planet, bring those together, we can create a new metric based on the biophysical operation of the way the world works according to all the living creatures in the world and all the available resources. We can begin to understand a sustainable value for our currencies. And the reason for that is that in the future, if we're going to make this big change in the way the world operates, we're going to have to recognize that the price signals are giving us the wrong information. We need to hear from the other side of this, which is that the value propositions and the worth of the resources on the earth have to come through our currency value. So in other words, all I'm saying is that when you go to the gas pump and you look at the price of oil, that's not the key indicator. The key indicator is how much your money is worth when you're buying that oil. Because in a larger sense, the monetary system can be constructed so that it actually is based on carrying capacity and purchasing capacity. It's reflected in the sustainable value that you have, which your new currency represents. So if there's any metric that all this leads up to, that's what I would say would help to make sure that the planet becomes more sustainable, because once you have a sustainable value for your currency system, then we won't have booms and busts. Then we won't have fluctuations. We won't have inflation and deflation. There'll be a smooth curve. It'll work in relationship between the needs of living beings and the available resources on the planet.
Yeah, that sounds also in line with what Prout is saying, and I think to elucidate it a little bit more, this would mean, for example, to couple a currency not to, let's say, the speculation of Wall Street, for example, or like some sort of cryptocurrencies that are very volatile, but rather the things that I was mentioning, right? We can couple it to education, to healthcare, to food, to shelter, and as you were saying, to people and living beings and resources as they are available. And that's the idea I'm getting. Is that more or less?
Yeah, and the role of well, there's a couple things I would say in reaction to what you just said. The cryptocurrencies, what's important about that is the blockchain. It's not the way the blockchain has been operated to work in the private sector, because it's great that there's no governmental insight or oversight of the blockchain. On the other hand, and because it's good for a person's privacy. On the other hand, the real problem is it's being used for dark money. It's being used for criminal enterprise on a huge scale. And so the blockchain technology is what's needed, but it has to be, I think, used in the public sector. Used to be used in terms of creating this new sustainable value and this new kind of currency that would work in a more unified world, where, as I say, there was the planetary and the states, and then the local and regional levels of the commons. Those are very important ways of looking at the world as it needs to be reconstituted. But at the same time, unless we have the correct metrics that do what you're talking about in terms of creating equitable value through economic democracy that leads to making sure that everyone's needs are met, and as well as all creatures, in terms of neo-humanism, I think that there's a way of getting to that, but it certainly isn't on the path that we've been following in the past in terms of the market economies.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. So, taking all of this that we've been talking into account, to give another example, what kind of rules, safeguards, or feedback systems would cooperatives especially need to follow to stay accountable to their communities and to avoid basically reproducing the same exploitative and extractive logic of many large corporations?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that this is a very important question. And the main thing is to realize how urgent this is to create this framework, because we have to create a degree of interdependence in the world in this century that the world has never seen before. So it's all very experimental, and we don't have a lot of time to waste. My career spans 50 years, and what I've seen is that many of these ideas have existed from the early 70s, even in the 1960s, but it's never been given the space to be able to build concrete or meaningful structures around a path to getting there. I've been involved in a number of different projects that have anticipated these new structures and metrics to get this off the ground. Had the world acted in the 1970s, when some of these proposals were on the table, we'd be on course to become a sustainable world. But neoliberalism intervened, and now we're seeing the chaos that's erupted as a result of that. So what are some of these metrics? They fall along the lines of the sustainability I was talking about. Unless sustainability is behind all of our metrics, we're not really going to get very far. And I would recommend to any of your listeners to look at the field of biophysical economics, because there you see these important tools like energy return on investment, or, as I think it's more technically correct to say, energy return on energy investment. What does that mean exactly? It in a sense means we're all waking up to this fundamental fact that it takes energy to create more energy, right? And so the ratio between the original energy and the energy we're created is becoming closer and closer together, meaning that there's no longer much incentive to extract oil from the ground if it's not going to produce returns to the oil companies. In other words, measuring these kinds of energy flows in the world does not just pertain to oil, it pertains to all forms of energy. And so biophysical economics really finally has gotten on that track. And it's not, some people confuse it with ecological economics, and it's not, it's different. It actually measures the thermodynamics of the world in a way that understands that, the first two laws of thermodynamics are essentially energy can be converted into matter and matter back into energy. The second law of thermodynamics says, well, yeah, but in the process of doing that, you're creating heat as to do the industrial process of converting one thing into the other. And when you do that, you change the nature of matter or energy by creating entropy. And the CO2 that goes into the air, the microplastics that we're putting into the ocean, and all the various things that are phenomena that are, the fertilizers that we're spreading in the soils, all those things are creating entropy on a scale that we're recognizing in terms of those planetary boundaries. So what I'm getting at is the metrics that we need to use going into the future have everything to do with the energy flows that are taking place, because it's those energy flows that will connect us from the carrying capacity of the planet to the purchasing capacity of people to meet their own needs. That's the direct connection. So what I'm suggesting is that the old market idea was to get a return on your investment. Now, if we're looking really at the energy return on the energy that we've invested, that changes the metrics completely into a different kind of format. Then, and there are many other metrics that have emerged in the field of biophysical economics that are similar to that. So I would say that's a good place to begin.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, I remember from high school and physics class learning this basic law, right? That energy is never lost. It's always just converted into another form of energy. So that's what you're basically talking about. It's very interesting that this has been combined with economics. These thermodynamic laws have found a way, to be combined. And I guess that's something we're moving towards in general, towards a more interdisciplinary approach, trying to combine the yeah, just ideas of different sciences in some fruitful manner.
Can I just say this one piece here? It's about the conversion of matter into energy and energy back into matter, but it's the degradation that creates. And that's very important to recognize, because that's what's behind the planetary breaching of the planetary boundaries. So, and little attention has gone into that. And what I would suggest to everyone to look up entropy, and just in a simple way to recognize that what it means is that disorder is being created as a result of that. That disorder in the geobiophysical chemistry is trickling back into societies. And Joseph Tainter says that, it's that kind of influence that helps to collapse a society. When that disorder really gets into the administration and the social sciences, then what's going to happen is that the society will collapse. And that's what I think we're looking at, the beginning stages of that collapse at the moment. So, so again, I would say it's not just the law of conservation of energy, it's the entropy law of the second law of thermodynamics, which is really even more necessary. The other point there is that what we have now is we go back to the sovereign states and the ability of governments to, we talked about what the Treaty of Westphalia and the sovereignty which was guaranteed to nation states. That sovereignty has become, especially after World War II, it has become a matter of sovereign debt. So you remember when a lot of the former colonial nations were freed after World War II, they said, okay, this is great. We're independent now. And then, what happened was a new form of dependence emerged, which had to do with the sovereign debt. So the richer nations and the corporations went to the newly independent colonial states and said, okay, you need to develop. How are you going to develop? Well, we don't know yet. And so, well, you're going to need money to do that. Right. So you're going to have to borrow that money because you're not going to be given it by your colonial power anymore. And so we have the multinational banks that could lend you money, or you have the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank who could assist you. But nonetheless, recognize that the condition of becoming a sovereign state, which you're doing now, is that you will engage in sovereign debt. So the sovereign debt, I would suggest to you, is the expression of entropy institutionalized in law, which is making entropy endemic across the planet because all nations now are either trying to stay out of sovereign debt or back into it. But the fact is that that is the protocol which we are using right now, which is replicating and reinforcing the degradation of energy across the world just by its nature of the way it works. So what I'd suggest to you is that there is a correlation between the indebtedness of a nation and the entropy which it's producing. So
Thanks,
that's
yeah.
where biophysical economics really ties in to real world problems, because on a broad scale, it's a direct measure of what we're not able to measure now just by looking at trade and finance on their own terms.
Yeah, thanks again for clarifying that. So let's move on to my final question. So now we've looked at different aspects of maybe ideas of economic democracy and how, maybe a future society could be structured, what would be the safeguards, the protocols that would need to be in place. For example, looking at a planetary the possibility of a planetary management of the ecological crisis. But so moving forward, how do you believe can societies cultivate the kind of leadership and civic culture needed for this transition that we were talking about? Meaning people who can make economic decisions with fairness and ecological integrity in mind, rather than just short-term power or profit.
Yeah, what's been lost over the centuries, and particularly in the last several decades, is a sense of civic virtue. And I think that's particularly true in Western nations, although not as much in Europe. I think in Europe is actually improved, generally speaking. Certainly in the United States, for example, the understanding of the importance of an approach to economic democracy has been completely lost. It's people. You say economic democracy to people and they don't know what you're talking about. And that's because the political parties never talk about it because it's not important to them. And so the culture doesn't express it. So what I'm getting at is I think that a new ethic has to take place and be cultivated across the world. And part of that is that groups need to meet, discuss these things. They need to become part of an interdependent framework, as I'd said, right from the local and regional up through the states, up to the planetary level. All of that has to be interlinked in ways that have never been done before. And so, there's been a vision of it in the past, but no one knew really how to get there. Now we're being forced that we have to find that interdependence. So there needs to be give and take at all in terms of making this work. But as long as people at local levels feel that all they are is consumers and they don't have control over their immediate resources, and as long as as long as people at the local levels have no control whatsoever over the planetary boundaries, and which the corporations, by and large, are doing most of the damage, then I think, a lot of things have to change. But a new ethic has to emerge in which all those conversations among people organizing now to create these new frameworks for local and regional commons. And we can see it through this bioregioning movement that's taking place everywhere, which is very similar to what P.R. Sarkar talked about as samaj. It has all the characteristics of samaj. But to link that samaj to a broader framework that supports it, I think is another area that needs to be looked at. And which is why I would go back to what I began with to say that there needs to be planetary negotiations especially between the global West and the global East, or the global East-South, meaning the BRICS, in terms of how to make that work and how to create the geopolitical context for all that. Because what it means is, as you said earlier, it sounds utopian, but the fact is it's not utopian. It's just a new order that needs to be created. And there have been new orders in various points of time in history. And that new order, as I've suggested, needs to be not only a new economic and political order, but a new monetary order. All of that's possible if people adopt a new ethic. And I think part of that ethic is to look at things not as global, but as planetary, because the planetary immediately brings into the equation the biological. And if anything, the past has taught us that the market economies are not interested at all in the biological. It's not part of their metrics. That's why GDP is passé, because it doesn't include the biological, meaning the dimension of life that is expressed not only among people but in living creatures, but in terms of the energy that is necessary to animate them. So in other words, the biological has an energy component to it, which can be found in the laws of thermodynamics. And that needs to be incorporated into what's being done. And that's on the technical level, but on the social level, it needs to be interpreted as a new kind of social contract in which people will claim new political power, states will have less political power, and states will also give up some of their power to the planetary agencies that need to be created to manage the boundaries. If we could do that, then we would have the framework for a new kind of conversation in a new order that would really resolve many of these crises. At the moment, I don't see that on the horizon. I see some groups looking at it and saying, well, something much larger needs to take place. But I don't think anybody's really systematized it in terms of how it actually could be effectuated, actually be expressed. And the longer time goes on into the 21st century, the more necessary that will become.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for your illuminating answers and the interview as a whole. I think, what you're saying like about samaj also is important. Like samaj is meaning this kind of creating a social movement for the welfare of all, for the welfare of all human beings and all living beings, and for the welfare of the planet. As you're saying, I think there are like many decentralized small groups trying to do it in their own way. And I feel like that's a big problem in general with the political left also, is that there are many different strands and variants of people who definitely want to do some good, and they do want to create a economic and social alternative to neoliberalism, but they are just at odds with each other sometimes, and they are definitely not collaborating enough. So that can be another step for the future of apart from the planetary government, also like a grassroots just unification of these groups that are trying to really change the world for the better socially and economically. Yeah, thank you again for the interview.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.